I want to cross to Melbourne now and catch up with Joe Gersh. He's a former director of the ABC. Thanks for joining us, Joe. I just want to give you a chance right at the outset to give us your assessment of the ABC's coverage of the events in the Middle East over the past 2 years.
Well, I've been reasonably vocal, Chris. Well, first of all, I should say thank you for inviting me on, and thank you for your understanding and support on this issue. I've been deeply concerned about the way in which the ABC has covered the Middle East over the last 2 years, and particularly on the question of why it's been missing in action on the subject of anti-Semitism here in Australia. And of course, the two are connected. And I've made the point a number of times, and I've heard you make the point any number of times, that the manner in which the ABC and other media outlets treat Israel and the war in Gaza reflects directly in action in connection with anti-Semitism here in Australia. And that point was recently made, precisely that point, was recently made by the Manchester Jewish community, of course, after that horrific murder on Yom Kippur in relation to the BBC, which in a sense, in a vibe sense, is very similar to the ABC in the way in which it reports this issue.
Yeah, this is, whatever you think about Avi Yemeni and about his tactics on this occasion, this is a point he made strongly to Matthew Doran in Israel, and that is that the reporting of the ABC across the board that demonises Israel, it has an impact not just globally but here on the way that Jewish Australians are treated.
Yeah, no, I think his point was well made. I do understand Justin Stevens feeling the need to stand by his people. He's entitled to do that. In fact, it's his obligation to do it. And I also understand that people need to be, journalists of all types, need to be respectful to their subjects, whether it's a planned interview or whether it's a spontaneous interview. When you put a microphone in front of somebody, perhaps they don't want to answer the question. But the point that he made was well made, and the point that you've made about the ABC's bias, I think, is also well made.
But this is, sorry, if I just jump in. If I can just jump in there, sorry, Joe, that delay is a bit annoying. No. But I just want to take up that point because I certainly wouldn't be blaming Matthew Doran for all the problems with ABC coverage, as that buttonhole interview suggested. And I've made the point here so many times with so many different reporters and programs that there's been systemic bias. And having been a director of the ABC, you would know where this comes from. This is not rogue journalists on the ground like John Lyons when he was in the Middle East, or Matthew Doran now, or others. This filters through the whole ABC news and current affairs system, and the responsibility for it has to be with people, surely, like Justin Stevens.
Totally. I agree with that totally, and he would take responsibility. The difficulty is that I think it's perfectly possible that he believes what he wrote to you, which is the ABC's coverage of this conflict has conformed to their statutory obligation to be impartial. I wouldn't agree with that assessment, and I know you don't agree with that assessment. So that's a question that needs to be properly and thoroughly canvassed. And I think whatever you might think about the last 2 years, the game fundamentally changed in the last 2 weeks. And at Hostages Square, and in the subsequent visit of President Trump to the Knesset, and following that Sharm el-Sheikh, the game changed. And again, the ABC has reported this in the way in which they typically do. Two Israeli soldiers were killed on the Israeli side of the Yellow Line in Gaza. 2 more Israeli families bereaved just after the hostages were returned to their families on that joyous day. Israel responded, as Israel would have to do. If you heard the ABC coverage, it began with Israel's response. Every time I'm driving in the car and I turn on the radio and it's time for the ABC News, because I'm still tuned to the ABC News, and the fanfare comes on, I say to myself, what has Israel done wrong this time? and I'm almost never disappointed. The ABC will begin its coverage by explaining the position from the perspective of the Palestinians as victims, and not from the perspective of an Israel that's engaged in a war of self-defence against an enemy determined to see Israel destroyed, and with it the Jewish people. So this whole thing is a matter. The whole thing is a matter of context, and I am deeply disappointed with the ABC. I don't necessarily think that buttonhole interviews are the way to deal with it, but nonetheless I do take the points that were made in that buttonhole interview because I think they're very valid, and I invite you, plead with you to continue to put a spotlight on the ABC, because it's required to be responsive to the complaints of Australians, but also it has an obligation of impartiality, and it's in the ABC's interest to do so. It's in the ABC's interest to be a trusted source of news, because that's its future, and if it's not trusted as a source of news, frankly, its future is questionable.
Brilliantly summarised, Joe Gersh. Thanks so much for that explanation and your insights, and you can count on it. I'll keep my focus on the ABC, and what you need to do is tune in your car radio to Sky News Radio at some stage. Thanks for joining us.